in these circumstances, to listen to this discussion or this talk about, well, we said despite, maybe beyond, but despite is the actual title, despite obfuscation and Orientalism, Palestine in modern history. It's really, honestly, an honor for me to be here and to be with so many colleagues and students to learn, all of us to learn together about Palestine in these times. So I'd like to start in the twilight of the Ottoman era, so the late 19th, early 20th centuries. There was a Jerusalemite Palestinian man, a pedagogue and a teacher by the name of Khalil as-Sakakini. And this man wrote, as I was teaching my students, he wrote desperate love letters to his future wife, or the woman he was courting, by the name of Sultana Abdu. Like so many others of his era, Sakakini was hopeful about the future, if gloomy about his immediate marital prospects. In 1908, he opened a school that would become a famous school, an ecumenical school, open to students of all faiths in his native city of Jerusalem, called the Constitutional School, Al-Madrasa al-Dusturiya. He did not believe in caning students or in teachers forcing students to listen to boring lectures. Sakakini reflected in many ways a multi-religious late Ottoman Mashriq, an Arab East, a world that was brimming with faith in a modern future, but uncertain, of course, given the pluralism of this region, uncertain of its specific contours. The crucial point I'm trying to get across is this. Like so many other Palestinian and Arabs of the late 19th century, Sakakini was not living his life waiting for colonialism to unfold. Palestinian men and women lived, loved, quarreled, argued like any other people in this region. Most were Muslim, others were Eastern or Sephardic or Arab Jews. Many were Christians of various Eastern denominations or more recent Protestant denominations. My great-grandfather, in fact, was one of these converts to Protestantism from Greek Catholicism. He opened, in fact, ironically, given where we are today, he opened the first Baptist church in Palestine, in Nazareth, after a trip that took him from his native Safed to Texas, to Waco, I think, after which he returned to Palestine and to his wife, who bore him another daughter, my maternal grandmother. Most, of course, did not travel as far as my great-grandfather to the United States, or as far as Khalil Sakakini, who himself spent a miserable year between New York and Maine in 1907 trying to make money to sort of convince his future wife that he was worthy of her. Rather, most people lived their lives in late Ottoman Palestine in an interconnected Mashriq that for centuries had linked cities like Damascus, Sidon, Akka, Haifa, Beirut, Tripoli, Aleppo, Bethlehem, Jaffa, Nablus, and all their hinterlands together. Like every other Palestinian man and woman, there was no need for Khalil al-Sakakini or Sultana, his wife, or my great-grandfather for that matter, let's put it down there, to explain the obviousness of their humanity or the naturalness of their attachment to their own land. It was just obvious and given. When Sakakini was an 18-year-old man, however, there was a Jewish Zionist journalist in Vienna by the name of Theodor Herzl, who wrote and published his famous 1896 tract called The Jewish State. Herzl set himself a profoundly difficult task at the time. He had never been, when he wrote this book, he had never been to Palestine. He knew no Middle Eastern language, but he sought to convince his German language readers and Jews in Europe more broadly and Christian European statesmen whose support he desperately wanted why a Jewish national state established in faraway Palestine, or even more distant Argentina, had to be done to combat European anti-Semitism. He insisted that such a modern state would constitute what he called a portion of a rampart of Europe against the, that's Palestine, that's Sakakini, a portion of the rampart of Europe against Asia, an outpost of civilization as opposed to barbarism. The most remarkable aspect of Herzl's writing from our vantage point today is how utterly unconcerned he was with natives of Palestine such as Sakakini, whose land he and the Zionist movement he led sought to acquire to build their fantasy of an exclusively Jewish state in what had always been a multi-religious land. Herzl, of course, knew that there were native bodies in Palestine, and he also knew that these bodies constituted a problem for his fantasy of building a Jewish state there. But he did not see Palestinians as a people with significant history or humanity worth seriously considering. What I'm saying is hardly original. In his 1979 book, The Question of Palestine, Edward Said raised exactly these points. He described how European Orientalism and obfuscation was key to legitimating colonial Zionism in Western imagination, and thus colonial Zionism eventually on the ground in Palestine. And here we are today, 75 years after the Nakba, at another pivotal and far darker moment. The erasure of Palestinian humanity and history has taken on genocidal proportions. The perverse irony is that 5 decades after Edward Said wrote and published his book, The Question of Palestine, the state of Israel today and over the past 5 decades has steadily scraped off the liberal veneer of the brutal reality of what an ethno-religious nationalist state means to its Palestinian subjects and citizens. Long before October 7th, in fact, Israelis as a whole have overwhelmingly accepted, participated in, condoned, and enforced a system of apartheid across Palestine. Palestinians in the West Bank are not allowed, for example, to live with their spouses in East Jerusalem or inside Israel itself, and Samera can correct me if I'm wrong on the details, whereas Jewish settlers living in occupied Palestine can come and go as they please. A Jew anywhere in the world with no actual relationship to Palestine can, quote, return and become a citizen by virtue of their Jewishness. A Palestinian who is native and all their exiled and stateless descendants, however, are not allowed to exercise their actual right of return under international law to their own lands and homes and villages from which they were dispossessed in 1948 or 1967 because they are not Jewish. The reality has been crystal clear to any who has had eyes to see, ears to hear, and a heart to feel. There have been shocking pogroms in the West Bank last year, segregation in Al-Khalil, Hebron for decades, and systematic discrimination inside Israel that would make any American raised after the victory of civil rights in this country blush. This apartheid reality has been documented time and time again by major international human rights organizations such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, by Palestinian human rights organizations, and by Israel's own leading human rights organization, B'Tselem. And all this long before October 7th. How then to explain the continued overwhelming Western state and media support for Israel's, quote, right to defend itself after Palestinian guerrillas broke out of the ghetto of Gaza and attacked and killed and massacred soldiers, police, armed settlers, and of course civilians on 7 October 2023? How to explain not just the erasure of crucial Palestinian context, but its substitution by another historical narrative that entirely vacates Palestinian history and context and Palestinian humanity to the point that Joe Biden, our president in this country, can say that the attacks of October 7th were, quote, as consequential as the Holocaust, end quote. My point, in other words, is not simply to draw your attention to what is being denied, removed from view, not talked about, but what is actually talked about. How one narrative of actual Palestinian history that's been readily available to anyone who can read or see has been utterly submerged by another Eurocentric philo-Zionist one that forces Palestinians into the role of being the anti-Semitic persecutor of the Jews and at worst, neo-Nazis. My other point is to underscore the ethical and political consequences of this substitution. This may explain why the obvious is ignored time and again, such as the fact that Israel has waged 5 massive military assaults on the besieged Gaza Strip that's been besieged since 2007, mowing the grass in Israeli official parlance. Israel has terrorized and traumatized, or these campaigns, these 5 military campaigns, have traumatized and terrorized an entire generation of children who compose and comprise nearly half of Gaza Strip's population. And my talk may explain the fury and self-righteousness of Western outrage at Palestinian violence, as awful as this violence has been, which is always coded as, quote, barbarism, there's that word again that Herzl used in 1896, and terrorism, and the Western justification then of ever greater violence in the name of crushing violence that violence itself has produced and provoked. It may explain why advocates or activists, many in this room, for Palestinian humanity, including, of course, Edward Said, we must remember, so often find themselves voices in the liberal Western wilderness, and why they are so often framed and defamed as anti-Semites, even as stateless, brutalized, and persecuted Palestinians are being obliterated before our eyes today, or why professors and administrators across this country thought it was acceptable to insinuate or condemn students publicly for standing in solidarity with Palestine and the Palestinians as hateful and anti-Semitic, or why it's been asserted time and again that the Palestinians hate Israelis and attack Israelis not because the Israelis are colonizers or settlers or living on stolen Palestinian land in close proximity in a state that has made Palestinian life, especially in the Gaza Strip, utterly miserable for decades and decades, but because we are told that Palestinians hate Jews because they are Jews. It's an extraordinary sort of remaking of the history. Palestinians, in short, are reduced ultimately to anti-Semites, who thus deserve, presumably, the terrible, devastating Israeli collective punishment and retribution to which they have been subjected for the past 123 days. Even the word ceasefire has become heretical in the liberal West. We are now 123 days into an unprecedented attack on humanity in the 21st century. Israel, as Professor Lucarelli mentioned, has deliberately crippled and destroyed every university in the Gaza Strip. It has destroyed every hospital or attacked every hospital in the Gaza Strip. It has killed, wounded, and maimed over 100,000, as last count, stateless and besieged Palestinians in the past 4 months, the vast majority of whom, of course, are women and children. And it has created conditions of mass starvation and mass dehydration for 2.2 million people deliberately, with full knowledge, and with the Democratic Joe Biden's administration's direct support. So what I hope to understand at the broadest level is why so many across the liberal West continue to obdurately defend colonial Zionism, given the massive amount of documentation that is so readily available, that illustrates just how systematically cruel and violent and manifestly unjust this ethno-religious project has always been to the indigenous population of Palestine. What I also hope to understand is why so many continue to apologize for, to justify, and thus to enable and perpetuate the first genocide of history to be live-streamed worldwide on every phone, every tablet, and every computer. How to explain why so many people have a choice, when they have a choice to speak or to write or to stand against genocide, instead choose to become its mute witnesses, paralyzed by fear, or worse, its enthusiastic scribes and stenographers. The simple answer, of course, is that these latest Western expressions of philo-Zionism, in support of Israel's now obviously total war against the Palestinians, has exposed more clearly than ever a ruthless double standard that has always underlay Western philo-Zionism. Jewish and then Israeli history and life are cherished as part of an allegedly enlightened and civilized Western world. Palestinian, Muslim, and Palestinian Christian history and life are fundamentally devalued. This double standard, of course, has a long, long history. Protestant enthusiasts and theologians in Europe and North America had long fantasized in the 18th and 19th centuries about the idea of the return of the Jews to biblical Palestine in fulfillment of biblical prophecy. But they had actually no interest in the actually existing diverse, multi-religious population in actual Palestine. In the 19th century, Zionist Jewish nationalist movement emerged in Eastern and Central Europe among European Ashkenazi Jews, such as the aforementioned Theodor Herzl, whom we alluded to, but it too at first largely ignored the presence of the native Palestinian population. Part of this fact was geography, in the sense that Zionism, you have to remember, did not emerge among the Eastern, Arab, Sephardic, Jewish, indigenous communities of the Middle East. Because, of course, there were Jewish communities in the Middle East, and they were indigenous to the Middle East. But Zionism did not emerge there. It emerged in Europe. Its leaders were not Arab or Eastern or Sephardic Jews, but European Ashkenazi Jews. Herzl, for example. Then Chaim Weizmann, after World War I. Then David Ben-Gurion. Then Golda Meir, and there's a movie about her coming out, or it's come out. Then Menachem Begin, and so on and so forth. Its ethno-religious nationalist ideology was forged not by the pluralism of the Middle East, but rather by the competing racial and ethnic and linguistic nationalisms of Europe itself. The racial anti-Semitism of the West, the violence and the hatred of Jews in the West, was, of course, one of the main catalysts for European Jewish nationalism, but that itself was alien to the rhythms of religious difference and coexistence so familiar to the diverse inhabitants of the Ottoman Islamic East. Recall as well that the Zionist project developed openly in its first decades as a colonialist project in an era when European empires routinely segregated humanity into a hierarchy of superior and inferior races. In other words, the Zionists weren't ashamed by this term because Europeans and Americans were not ashamed by the term colonialism. So while leading Zionists grappled indeed with racial anti-Semitism in Europe, they were also desperate to belong to this Europe. They expressed, shared, contributed to, and circulated many of the foundationalist racist tropes of the 19th century Western Europe, the Western culture. That is to say, the non-West was considered to be manifestly inferior. The lands of indigenous populations were considered to be largely empty or underutilized, and hence subject to legitimate colonization. And the removal of native populations or peoples was necessary and inevitable. Recall Herzl's statement that the Jewish national state he dreamed of would become, quote, a rampart of a portion of Europe against Asia. Recall as well that one of the most notorious slogans of the Zionist movement, which began as a Christian Zionist slogan and then became a Zionist nationalist slogan, was a land without a people for a people without a land. The underlying point here is that both Christian and Jewish versions of colonial Zionism were predicated on solving Europe's Jewish question by removing or returning Jews en masse to Palestine as if Palestinians did not exist or as if they fundamentally did not matter. This obfuscation became ever more dangerous in the 20th century. It became ever more dangerous to the Palestinians as Zionism moved from colonial fantasy to colonial practice after the Balfour Declaration. So the British Balfour Declaration of November 1917 described the Palestinians, who of course were the vast majority of the population of Palestine at the time, as merely, quote, non-Jewish communities, who paled, presumably, in historical, religious, and civilizational significance when compared to what the Balfour Declaration explicitly identified as the more important Jewish people. So non-Jewish communities versus Jewish people. The British mandate over post-Ottoman Palestine that was established in 1920 privileged foreign European Zionists legally, administratively, and politically. Native Muslim and Christian Palestinian bodies, nevertheless, had a real. And for Jewish Zionist nationalists, such as Weizmann and Jabotinsky and Ben-Gurion, who wanted to build a Jewish state in Palestine, Palestinian bodies had a tangibly unwelcome presence. Unlike the distant academic Protestant clergymen obsessed with biblical prophecies, colonial Zionists were increasingly preoccupied with what they now described as an Arab problem or an Arab question. That is, an Arab problem or an Arab question of their own, that their own foreign European presence on the land invented. Because, of course, there was no Arab question until the Zionists arrived in Palestine to create a Jewish state. How, in short, the problem was to transform a land actually inhabited by an overwhelming majority of Arabs into a Jewish state. As soon as Zionism moved from Christian, Jewish, Western colonial fantasy to Western colonial practice, Muslim and Christian Palestinians inevitably were seen, as I said. And as such, they constituted, and they still constitute, a real impediment to the successful unfolding of colonial Zionism. Because you cannot build a Jewish state when you have an overwhelming Arab majority. The more the Zionist state structure was put in place under British colonial auspices and support during the British Mandate, which lasted from 1920 to 1947-48, the more the native anti-colonial resistance it generated, inevitably. Native resistance was through petitions, it was peaceful, it was through pleas, and of course it was also violent. Eventually, it compelled the British colonial rulers to figure out some way out of the inevitable morass that their philo-Zionist mandate, the British mandate, was designed to fulfill the terms of the Balfour Declaration, and yet the British mandate claimed that it had the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities in mind. And so the British tried to figure out a way out of this morass. And so in 1937, the British came up with this idea of a partition plan. The partition plan of 1937 was called the Peel Partition Scheme, which foreshadowed, of course, the 1947 UN Partition Plan of Palestine. Both plans, the British Imperial Plan of 1937 and then the UN Plan of 1947, both plans prioritized the making of a Jewish state in Palestine, not a secular or democratic state. Both plans embraced as a central idea that dispossessing the native Palestinian majority of much of its land and their homes to make way for a Jewish state was necessary, just, and inevitable. The 1937 Peel Partition Plan, in fact, admitted plainly the injustice of any partition to the Arab natives who owned, the British acknowledged, the vast majority of the land. And with a remarkable disingenuousness, let's skip over Churchill, with a remarkable disingenuousness, the Peel Commission lauded the proverbial generosity of the Arabs to justify their role at some sacrifice, the Peel Commission said, of the Arabs, at some sacrifice to themselves in solving what the Commission referred to as the West's Jewish problem. You can see it at the bottom there. In other words, the Arabs are generous and they're going to help us resolve our problem. It's going to hurt them, but they're helping contribute to a worldwide issue. I mean, it's an extraordinary amount of disingenuous, if not cognitive dissonance, if not racism. Again, Samera can help figure this out with me. Right away, this is 1937, right away in 1938, there was an Arab scholar by the name of George Antonius who wrote a famous book called The Arab Awakening, which he published, as I said, in 1938. And in that book, and its final pages, Antonius wrote, and I'm sorry for the typos, but anyway, Antonius wrote, the treatment meted out to Jews in Germany, this is 1938, by the way, the treatment meted out to Jews in Germany and other European countries is a disgrace to its authors and to modern civilization. But posterity, he added, will not exonerate any country that fails to bear its proper share of sacrifices needed to alleviate Jewish suffering and distress. To place the brunt of the burden upon Arab Palestine, Antonius wrote, is a miserable evasion of the duty that lies upon the whole of the civilized world. It is also morally outrageous. In other words, to make the Palestinians pay the price in the way the Peel Commission admitted was going to happen to solve the West's anti-Semitism problem. Despite Antonius's pleas, US politicians, of course, rejected allowing the survivors of the Holocaust several years later into the United States, just as Arthur Balfour himself had at the turn of the 20th century rejected Eastern European Jewish immigration into England. But these same US politicians after World War II, and journalists and intellectuals across the United States, supported the sending of 100,000 Jewish displaced persons to Palestine in the name of decency and humanitarianism. Precisely as Antonius had feared, native Palestinians were entirely shut out of the decision-making process that directly affected them. In November 1947, the Western-dominated UN voted to partition Palestine into an Arab state and a Jewish state, despite the fact that the overwhelming majority of the population was Palestinian, and despite the fact that the Jewish state that was allocated by the UN was larger than the Arab state. I mean, it's an extraordinary, again, from a Palestinian perspective, from any perspective that says these are equal people, it's an extraordinary injustice. And despite the fact that centuries of Palestinian belonging on what had always been their land, villages, and towns and homes was so evident and obvious to the Palestinians, it didn't matter. The UN, and by I say the UN, we have to understand this is the UN before decolonization. So this was a European-dominated and American-dominated United Nations. The Nakba, or the calamity of 1948, nevertheless brutally resolved the problem of Palestinian bodies in a Jewish state that had long preoccupied colonial Zionists working in Palestine to create a Jewish state there. Before, during, and most of all after the War of 1948, Zionist forces expelled well over 800,000 Palestinians to neighboring lands, expropriated their homes, their books, their properties, their archives, and didn't allow them back, which is the crucial point in the ethnic cleansing. Khalil Sakakini, with whom I opened the story today, was one of the people who was expelled in 1948. He lost his property and he lost his archives and his library. This was a moment in 1948 where what we call the Gaza Strip was created. There was no Gaza Strip before 1948. There was the District of Gaza. But what happened after 1948 was the Gaza Strip, into which Palestinians from surrounding areas in what is today Israel were expelled, from which they were expelled. So in other words, Palestinians were expelled from the surrounding areas of South and Central Palestine into the Gaza Strip. Liberal Western states and leaders hailed the creation of an ethno-religious nationalist Jewish state in a historically multi-religious land. World War II and the creation of Israel in 1948 reflected, in short, more than Western settler colonialism as a practice of native elimination. And this is, I think, the key point. So there was, of course, expulsion. There was elimination. But the support of Israel in the West and the identification with Israel reflected more than just genocidal thinking. It reflected also a post-war Western humanism that was reborn after the terrors of World War II with a philo-Zionist core. My colleague at Rice University, I should say my former colleague at Rice University, the historian Daniel Cohen, has a book that's coming out soon called Philo-Semitism in Europe Since the Holocaust. In the book, Cohen shows in painstaking detail how in the wake of World War II, European philosophical, religious, and moral rehabilitation of man, white and Western man, of course, was predicated on the recognition of the history of real anti-Semitism in Europe and in the West that had culminated with, of course, the awful rise of Nazism. The creation of Israel as a Jewish state, therefore, represented an implied Western atonement for its own terrible past, and Israel even received reparations from Germany beginning in 1953. In this philo-Zionist turn to love Jews and Judaism in post-World War II Europe, and America, therefore, was to love the new state of Israel that was established in their name. Palestinians, who had been expelled and now languished in refugee camps, did not even figure in this moral calculus. They were completely absent. It's not a coincidence that the great black anti-colonial poet and writer Aimé Césaire castigated this post-World War II Western conception of the rights of man as pseudo-humanism. At exactly in this moment in his book called The Discourse on Colonialism, that was first published in 1955. Césaire was not writing about the Palestinians specifically, but more broadly about the Arabs in Algeria, the blacks in South Africa, Madagascar, and the Caribbean, the Vietnamese and other indigenous peoples of the world. Césaire noted how this Western pseudo-humanism was based on what he called a narrow and fragmentary, and then he also called it a sordid, racist conception of the rights of man. Césaire was disgusted by how post-war European states and societies were willing to finally condemn Hitler and anti-Semitism and the racism of anti-Semitism, but refused to abandon most of their colonial possessions without a bitter and sustained fight. Instead, he said, by splitting the fight against anti-Semitism, which the post-war West now deplored, from the fight against racism and colonialism more broadly, which the post-war West continued to uphold, one could love Israel. This is what I'm saying, not Césaire. One could love Israel and Jews and still hate Arabs and blacks and other natives. One could love the now largely absent Jews of Europe and love them instead in their new, and in philo-Zionist eyes, proper home in Israel, Palestinians again not visible. So the Western denial of an ancient, sustained, and meaningful Palestinian relationship to Palestine that started in the 19th century and continued into the 20th century continues until now, in fact, has had profoundly corrosive moral, political, and ethical effects. It has led to a series of philo-Zionist dogmas that continue to shape how current events are viewed and interpreted across the mainstream West. The most important of these dogmas is not to dare question Israel as a Jewish state, no matter what such a state does or implies to the native Muslim and Christian Palestinian survivors of the Nakba, who remain until now condemned to be at best precarious second-class citizens of a state that explicitly does not want them. Recall that the Palestinian survivors of the Nakba, who are today citizens of Israel, constitute 20% of Israel's population. Nearly 5 million other Palestinians live in varying degrees of humiliating unfreedom as stateless non-citizens across East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and of course, most obviously for us today, the Gaza Strip. And still millions of other Palestinians remain in exile, unable, as I said at the outset, to return home because they are not Jewish. Yet to question the professed Jewishness of a state, despite the blatant racism the state practices against its non-Jewish subjects and citizens, remember, Israel controls the entirety of historic Palestine today, remains largely unthinkable across the liberal West. For to question colonial Zionism is to question the sincerity and the implications of the West's alleged turn on its own anti-Semitic past. The second philo-Zionist dogma that shapes the contours of post-war Western humanism was to regard Israel as very much as an extension of an idealized West. Israel, of course, has classical music. It has European institutions. It has a modern army, pioneers, communal kibbutzes, and above all, it was considered in the 1950s to be a young nation, which contrasted with the background images of squalid, nameless Arab refugees. Israel was what the West wanted and needed after World War II, an emancipated part of itself, allegedly purged of its historical anti-Semitism. In the 1950s, therefore, Western liberals and leftists overwhelmingly and enthusiastically supported Israel, despite its treatment of the largely invisibilized Palestinians. And this included Western trade unions, liberal theologians, radicals, socialists, and so on. The third dogma was to make actual Palestinians unrelatable to Western humanism, except as a negative value, as, again, to go back to Edward Said in Orientalism, as he pointed out in his book, Orientalism, decades ago, and to represent Palestinians as either sullen, dehistoricized refugees or equally dehistoricized, enraged, and violent people who violate the very core of post-war Western humanism because they oppose colonial Zionism. So in other words, stripped of context, stripped of history, stripped of lived experience, Palestinians have been made into beings who cannot love, they can only hate. Palestinians are cast outside of proper history. They appear to return only to threaten what had been in reality an artfully and irredeemably Eurocentric telos of a sanctified Israel. After 1948, in any case, the Zionist movement coalesced around the new state of Israel and steadily invested in building up a massive presence, a massive affective relationship with a strong presence in every major Western state and society, especially in the United States. The Zionist movement and the Israeli state mobilized Jewish communities and sought to make Zionist ideology hegemonic among them. Their axiom was that to be Jewish was to be Zionist, and to feel, think, and believe that the state of Israel represented the entirety of the Jewish people. See on this exact point a new film and a recent documentary made by some anti-Zionist Jewish intellectuals called Israelism that features, in fact, a former Cal student by the name of Simon Zimmerman. It's a superb documentary and I highly recommend it. So the positive emotional relationship to Israel was reinforced by a campaign of memorialization of the horrors of the Holocaust across the liberal West after 1967. The flip side of this memorialization of the horror of Nazi genocide was the consistent elision of a hugely consequential fact that George Antonius had alluded to and prophesied and foreshadowed in 1938, namely that Palestinians collectively had been made to pay the heaviest price after World War II for the creation of a Jewish state on their lands, despite the fact that Palestinians had no history of Western-style anti-Semitism that the state of Israel was meant to be the atonement for. The collective result of this echo chamber of furious, self-righteous morality the collective result of this is an echo chamber of furious, self-righteous morality that was overwhelming and evident after October 7th. This self-righteousness is predicated, as I said from the outset, on obfuscation and substitution of one narrative for another. Recall that Israel was established and legitimated in the Western-dominated UN just as the era of high Western colonialism was coming to an end, and just before the great age of decolonization. Only the denialism of Palestinian history and humanity can sustain the extraordinary self-congratulatory discourse about Israel and the liberal West that came to the fore in the 1950s and 1960s, about Israel having shared values, about Israel being both a Jewish and in fact, more recently than that, Israel being both a Jewish and a democratic state that made the desert bloom, that Israel has a right to exist. Not people have a right to exist, but a state has a right to exist, that Israel has a, quote, moral army, and so on and so forth. All these slogans are totally disconnected and contradicted, of course, by the reality of the Palestinian lived experience. Just as obviously, however, nowhere is the anachronism of a colonizing state more obvious than in Israel today, which openly, politically, administratively, juridically, is committed to the supremacy of one ethno-religious group over other ethno-religious groups in a manner that directly recalls what are today totally discredited systems of apartheid that used to be the norm in the Western world, but are no longer acceptable anywhere in the world except in Israel. So while the Jim Crow US South was dismantled nearly 60 years ago, and apartheid South Africa fell 30 years ago, and other secular colonial policies such as Canada and Australia, for example, provide maybe completely sham native land acknowledgements as a way at least of symbolically acknowledging the terrible sins of settler colonialism, Israel still celebrates an unreconstructed 19th century ideology in 21st century form. My point is that Israeli leaders and individuals say things about Palestinians and Arabs, and more importantly, do things to them that are right out of a 19th century playbook of colonialism. They feel entitled to say horrific things because they feel entitled to say horrific things. Where is it? So I go back here. Well, I don't have, oh, maybe it's over here. They feel entitled to say horrific things because the liberal West has never called them out. To describe Palestinians, for example, as human animals or as children of darkness is revealing enough of a culture of denial and impunity. But we've also seen Israeli settlers marching in East Jerusalem chanting death to the Arabs for years and years. To read an Israeli general by the name of Giora, I apologize for the pronunciation, Iland, writing in a major Israeli newspaper on November 19th, calling openly for, quote, severe epidemics among the Palestinians in southern Gaza to, quote, bring victory closer, recalls for me at least the British General Amherst who gave smallpox-infected blankets to the Shawnee and Delaware nations in the 18th century. Finally, there's also an overtly fascist political party in Israel called, if I'm not mistaken, Jewish Power. Yet despite the mountain of evidence of a state of anachronism, Israel is given, as I said, a pass time and again because of the narrative that suggests that a state built on another people's land represents the mantle of post-Holocaust anti-Semitic piety and morality and a redemption of Western humanism, just as it's been represented time and again since its foundation in 1948. Philo-Zionist liberals all the while look away, look at the ground, look past Palestinians as if they don't exist with meaningful history and humanity. Again, the reason is startlingly obvious. If one were to genuinely recognize Palestinian history and humanity and equality and human rights and national rights, so crumbles a major pillar of the edifice of post-war Western humanism and the morality that it claims to have. So I think I want to end at this point. I have a long section about resistance, Samera. The point about the resistance that I was going to talk about was that the Palestinians were ejected from history in 1948. They became, as Ghassan Kanafani says in his famous novella, Men in the Sun, stateless and unprotected refugees, hence the importance of UNRWA, which is today being defunded by the West, that was established after 1948. The Palestinians were pushed out of history and pushed out of political consciousness of the West. They only reemerged through what Samera studies, if I'm not mistaken, they only reemerged in Western consciousness through their armed struggle and through the spectacular in the visual sense of hijackings, terrorism, and so on and so forth, And they were always like sort of in this position of being either not seen, but when they were seen as terrorists. The Palestinians, it's true, were galvanized and sustained by anti-colonial solidarity from across the Third World in the 1960s and 70s that peaked with Yasser Arafat's famous speech at the UN in 1974. But these same Palestinians remained largely outside the ambit of Western empathy. The Palestinian paradox was to be terrorists if they disturbed the state that oppressed them, and to be terrorized if they did not. The demonization of Palestinian resistance as evil terrorism, decontextualized, in fact, builds on centuries-old genealogies of colonial and racist depictions of indigenous and slave revolts in Asia, Africa, and the Americas. The Palestinians, though, have the added burden of having to contend with the fact that they're oppressed by the archetypal victim in modern Eurocentric Western consciousness. The anti-colonial struggle of the Palestinians, in other words, is almost Sisyphean. Decontextualized and dehistoricized Palestinian resistance against the Jewish colonizing state that they see as a colonizing Jewish state is seen in the West as a terrible reincarnation of a demonic anti-Semitic past. Such a view allows even privileged Zionists in the West and in Israel to believe themselves to be real victims, even as Palestinians are being slaughtered today by Israel before the world. Hence the constant misleading refrain that the events of October 7th were the deadliest attacks on the Jewish people since the Holocaust, as if the Palestinians are Nazis and not actually engaged in, we can say deplorable, we can say horrible, but in the end, it's an anti-colonial context. Hence the constant conflation of Palestinians as new Nazis. Hence the constant conflation that all of us are being subjected to of anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, as if the call to Palestinian freedom is somehow hatred of Jews. Never mind the fact that there are many anti-Zionist Jews, such as Jewish Voice for Peace. The well-known Israeli historian anticipated this form of thinking and this denialism in a famous interview that was published in the Israeli newspaper Haaretz in 2004. He said, quote, "We are the greater victims in the course of history." He also said, "We are also the greater potential victim. Even though we are oppressing Palestinians, we are the weaker side here." So we're oppressing the Palestinians, but we're the more important historical victim. And we're the weaker side here, even though we're oppressing the Palestinians. It's a rampant form of narcissism, rooted in profound denial of Palestinian history and context. But it also reflects, and I'll end here, the assumptions of philo-Zionism that hold to stand with Israel is not to hate Palestinians, but is to love Jews and cherish Jewish identity. But to stand with Palestinian liberation is ipso facto to love, not to love Palestinians, humanity, justice, equality, or freedom, but allegedly to hate Jews, and even worse, to want to annihilate them again. One chilling conclusion of this is clear to see everywhere around us today. Real bigots and actual anti-Semites can be racist against Arabs and Muslims so long as they claim to love Israel. Note what's happening in Germany, where there's a xenophobic racism, Islamophobia, but it's always packaged as supporting Israel. Note Christian Zionist John Hagee, who appeared in the so-called March for Israel in Washington, D.C. Note how the U.S. Senate unanimously passed including Republicans and Democrats, including extremist Republicans, passed a resolution in October 2023, specifically condemning, quote, anti-Israel, pro-Hamas student groups. Why all this? Why all this now in 2023, 2024? Because the narrative of substitution that has been so central to the legitimation of colonial Zionism in Palestine is, in fact, despite the genocide, is being dismantled myth by myth, point by point, fact by fact, and above all, generation by generation. Ironically, due to the fact that Israeli actions and policies are so obvious in an era of social media. The entire world can see this. South Africa's case at the ICJ reinforces this. But above all, younger generations, including people in this room, see, including brave, young, anti-Zionist Jewish individuals and groups like Jewish Voice for Peace, refuse the racist, Eurocentric European humanism and Western humanism that has been at the heart of this sort of edifice of somehow not seeing what's right before their eyes. So there's an attempt to turn back the clock, but it won't work. And so I'd like to end here, Samera, because it seems to me that the crucible of Gaza, more clearly than any previous point in the history of Palestinian tribulations, more than 1967, I would say even more than 1948, although it's not about, exposes, it seems to me, overwhelming evidence of the moral and political failure of colonial Zionism on the ground in Palestine that can no longer be obfuscated. It exposes the narcissism, the ignorance, the depravity of many secular and religious supporters of Israel in the West, whether they're Christian or Jewish or any other faith. Because unlike the Nakba of 1948, when the Philo-Zionist West elided the Palestinians and pretended not to see their tribulations, remember they were just refugees and they were pushed into camps that nobody could see. Today, the mutilated, broken, terrorized, traumatized bodies of millions of Palestinians are in full view of the modern world, The reality is that as much as Israel might wish, there is no military solution against the Palestinians. The Palestinians are not going to disappear. Neither racism, nor apartheid, nor the hideous wall, nor the sham peace process, nor the deliberate mischievous conflation of anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism will make the Palestinians disappear as a people, nor stop them or their allies worldwide from all faiths from fighting and advocating for their liberation. And until that future is achieved, until there is equality for Jews, Muslims, and Christians in Palestine and Israel, we all have a fundamental choice to make. Each of us has to decide which side of history we want to stand, and whether we are for or against real justice, for or against real freedom, real equality, and real love for all people, for every single individual between the river and the sea. Thank you.
Thank you, Ussama, for this really not only impressive talk, but you've managed to cover first, I think, more than a century, taking us from the late 19th century into the present moment. You've managed to ask of us also so many questions, and it's admirable. So thank you for everything that went into putting this talk together and covering all these grounds. Since I had a very brief conversation with Ussama prior to the talk, and I'm listening to it in full only now. So I'm just going to go over a couple of points that I find interesting to perhaps discuss, and then ask you a few questions. Some of them I'll just offer some remarks. Others I'd like to think more with you if possible. But what is striking is that this talk about history and the present is really a talk about what explains this ongoing support for Israel today. What explains our universities, administrators' support and lack of any critical distance from a state that is carrying out genocide? What explains all these, efforts that refuse to read this moment for what it is, especially in the West, obviously? But also what is lost? What is the price of actually not getting it? What is the price of refusing to read reality for what it is, beyond its mystification? And we learn in the talk that we must also think about Western humanism as implicated in the production of the worldlessness of Palestinians. And I think that is one of the main insights of your talk today, Ussama. And that what explains, in a way, that one is protecting themselves, right? That Western humanists are also protecting a particular legacy that they have participated in. But what is lost, and this is also Ussama's sort of work as a historian, is a life, is a form of life that was not confined to a stretch of territory, but extended, where the Palestinian world extended beyond the strip, be it the Gaza Strip or the little, or Nablus as a confined city in the West Bank, or the different villages in the Galilee under the military regime when they were, during the 50s and the 60s, when they were confined to their own villages. Palestinians were put under military regime for 2 decades and confined to their own villages so that their lands could be confiscated and subjected to a military regime at the time that controlled their movement. So what is lost, we learn, is a form of life that was multi-religious, had ethno-religious, was characterized by ethno-religious plurality. What is also striking in the first moments of your talk is that it had horizons. It was not a shrunken existence. And that is what is lost then, what was lost then in the middle of the 20th century, and what continues to be lost today even more so, as we witness about 2 million, 1.95 million displaced Gazans in even a smaller stretch of territory. So this is perhaps a second point. We also learned that the partition plans, of which Ussama spoke during the mandate period, that led to the 1947 partition plan, is one that we must remember was obviously based on dispossession of the Palestinians, and that was accepted and taken for granted as the price that must be paid. But what is also interesting here, I think, is that for us to remember that British colonization of Palestine initially tried to produce mass colonization through a reform in the land regime. And that failed because by 1948, the land was still primarily owned by Palestinians. What they did manage to do is to change the demography of the place. So when mass colonization through the forces of private property and the market fail, we get the Nakba, we get the war of conquest, we get ethnic cleansing. Whatever the market didn't succeed to do, the Nakba accomplishes in 1948. So I think the 2 points that strike me, perhaps, or maybe one more point before I ask Ussama another question, and I'll begin there with that question, is this question of erasure. I want to ask about erasure, substitution, resistance, and the question of Western humanism. These are the 3 questions I want to ask about. So erasure and substitution. So it is not only that the Palestinian is erased, it is that there is a project of substitution, that something has to take place to be built anew. And so you mentioned the Gaza Strip, that existed only because of the 48 war, not because of the 67 war. A Gaza district was emptied out of its people, and settlements were built, massacres were carried out, and then a strip was declared to house all those refugees who were forced to leave their villages from the Gaza district and then were trapped in the Gaza Strip. So then we get October 7th, and that's an attack on Israel's territory. But that's not an attack on Israel's territory. That is actually an attack on the lands that used to be Palestinian. And so the substitution is quite important, because it's the substitution that then shapes the way we talk about things, because then we have a state, we have infrastructure, we have borders, we have something that has territorial integrity. And on the other side of things, we don't have any of that on the Palestinian. And that substitution is ongoing. So I guess and it's ongoing legally until today, when Israel declares Israel's nation-state law, for example, that it legislated a couple of years ago, that was an act of substitution. I guess the question is, given the substitution, would politics of inclusion suffice? Given that it's not only about the erasure of the Palestinian, and therefore just the recognition of the Palestinian, but there is actual substitution that changes the terms and the terrain. Would politics, liberal politics of recognition and of inclusion suffice, or something else much radical has to change for another future to emerge? My first question.
Okay, thank you, Samera. Can you hear me? Or can you hear me? Yes, thanks, Samera, for those brilliant points and summary of the talk. And I don't really have it's a huge question. Of course, liberal politics of inclusion absolutely does not suffice. You know that already. It's really a question of what is ethical. What are the forms of ethical anti-colonial resistance? Mm-hmm. And what is the role of armed struggle? What is ethical armed struggle? What does that mean? And above all, what is the difference between resistance and liberation? Because ultimately, I remember Ilan Pape spoke here in Berkeley a few months ago, and he made this point that angered people. But of course, I think it's absolutely correct. Neither side has a military option against the other.
Yeah.
Neither one has a. So the idea is try to elaborate a vision of commonality in this place, and what is the ethical way of achieving that? But that's what a politician, that's what leaders do. Our job as scholars ultimately is to sort of at least say what's before us and say it in the most honest way possible. That clearly the liberal politics of inclusion have not worked. They haven't worked. They don't work here. They're not going to work in a colonial reality. But then what is our role, and how do we think about resistance in all its varieties and forms? And as I said, what is ethical resistance that can ultimately lead us to liberation as opposed to just resistance? You see, and that's the most difficult thing that people have to think about more. How do we include more people without falling into the trap of liberal inclusion?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so this does bring me to the second question concerning resistance. Whether it's military or otherwise, because faced from your presentation, the Palestinians are not only facing Israel, they're actually facing the West, right? They're confronted with the powers of the West, and a particular project of the West, of the post World War II West that emerges from that moment. And so, in a way, it is there needs to be a communication to the world as well. Because this is a people that has become the victim of various forces that coalesced around a particular sensibility and a way of centering specific sufferings over others, right? And so when one confronts the world, I guess this is also another difficult question for you, but when one confronts the world, as one does in this particular case, in the case of Palestinians, then to what extent is the Palestinian resistance also communication to the world, and are we ready to receive it, to hear it?
Who's we?
Well, that is, Are some people ready to hear it?
Well, I mean,
as precisely that.
That's a huge question, Samera. You're much more sophisticated than me, honestly. I've always said Samera just runs circles intellectually around me, and I mean that sincerely. But like the point about, I mean, I think Samera, we're equally shocked and dismayed after the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, issues a preliminary ruling saying that there is, in fact, plausible evidence that there's a case of genocide that has to be pursued and investigated pursuant to South Africa's case. You know, and we've all seen what's happened in Gaza. What do the Western states do, led by the United States? They cut aid to UNRWA. I mean, it's the most shockingly sort of cruel, inhumane sort of thing that they could do based on Israeli propaganda, as far as we can tell, right? I mean, based on totally unsubstantiated claims that individuals with UNRWA may have done X, Y, and Z on October 7th. but you're cutting off the Palestinians entirely from. So in that sense, and what's happened, what we witnessed over the past 4 months, is a complete disillusionment with this idea that there's any faith or hope in Western states as such. At the same time, I think it's important to sort of talk about we're in a different kind of geography because it's not anymore global north versus global south, in the sense that there are people in the global north, and in this room you see many people, and there are solidarity networks that are being built across the global north that connect Black Lives Matter with Palestinian solidarity and so on and so forth. There are many different forms of mobilization and organization that I think do offer some kind of hope for the future, but honestly, the most important thing, of course, is the continued presence of the Palestinians on the ground, not just in Gaza, not just in the West Bank, not just in East Jerusalem, not just inside historic Palestine, inside Israel, inside 48, but also, of course, in the refugee camps, a sense, a reconstitution of a liberation movement. But the problem is we're always stuck in this thing of resisting elimination and erasure. And we're overwhelmed with that. That's the overwhelming task of the moment. And it's much more difficult than to move to what you're talking about, which is a project of liberation. The two are not the same. And we've often been stuck in the first because of the overwhelming geopolitical forces that we can see with Gaza, what's going on with Gaza. But we also see that at the end of 123 days, the Palestinians are still there.
Yeah.
And so that's where we are.
Yeah, and at these various junctures, of course, it's the liquidation of the question of Palestine that has been the attempted liquidation, to which the resistance and others had to then respond. Yeah. And this remains sort of a project, the liquidation of the question of Palestine, since the 50s, obviously. Okay, I had a third question, but since we have 10 more minutes before we leave the room, I thought I would take 2 to 3 questions from the audience, and I'm gonna ask you in the back. You're raising your hand, and the other person hidden in the back with their hand, yes, with the mask. And I'm gonna take another question from this side. Please, no, you start, but I'm just looking at this side to take a question.
Is there a mic for her?
Oh, there is no mic apparently. You can just raise your voice. Oh, there is a mic? Hello?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
Hi. So I have a question which kind of relates to the last question that you're getting into. The conversation about humanism, and I'm happy that Professor Makdisi, you brought in Cesar. I'm interested in understanding the conversation about calling Palestinians non-human, and it really brought a very specific discourse about racial humanism that for me kind of is rooted within, at least for me as someone who's, rooted in like Black geographies and Black cities, it's coming from like Winters 1492. Even like Wilderson's kind of engagement with Palestine really puts a very specific kind of structural engagement and like lineage, theoretical lineage. And this is like an advice as someone whose my project is on like notions of racial humanism in the modern Islamic world. How do you orient yourself in relation against and with this like epistemic vein of humanism that often is like, for me, is rooted in a very particular Western historical flows with a middle passage. And I'm working on particularly Iraq, and how do you then, I'm interested in understanding like the analytical frame. How do you position yourself, and like if you have any advice about how to navigate this conversation?
Thank you.
I feel like has historical specificities in the region that often gets like ignored or forgotten when we like cite scholars rooted within the Black Atlantic in a way.
Thank you. Thank you. So there was a question in the back near the...
Yes, I was the first to raise my hand and you purposely avoided calling on me.
No, I didn't purposely avoid. I looked in the back. I'm sorry. There are only 3 questions. I can take you as third if there is no hand on this side.
Thank you.
Yes, there was a question in the back. I know.
I have a question. Most of the presentation focused on, well, some of it focused on the history of Jewish nationalism, sort of devastating effects of Zionism. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about Palestinian nationalism that was happening perhaps in tandem with the rise of Zionism or since, and I was curious about that.
Thank you. So I'm going to take two more questions, one from the gentleman standing on the left side, and then if there's another hand on this side, as I promised. No? Okay. So, okay. I will take you after we here.
Thank you. As a morally conscious African American, I've been involved in the pro-Palestinian cause for over 20 years. I was involved in it when Professor Bazian was a doctoral student. The phrases peace process and two-state solution, I long ago believed, are merely PR phrases by the various different parties on both sides of this issue, on multiple Western continents, excuse me, because you ignored this for their own self-interest. And this was the two-state solution was a solution that was rejected by the ANC in South Africa. They recognized it as a Bantustan solution. So I'm wondering what the professor has to say about his position on the two-state solution and the various parties, if he wishes to comment, as I said, each for their own self-interest engaged in this charade. And where the hell a Palestinian state would be put at this time? Because the only solution could be a Bantustan solution. Nobody's going back to 1967 borders, as Chomsky claims they would. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. One last question. We have 5 more minutes for Ussama to answer and for the question to be raised. Where do you position yourself in relation to other literature that does Black study and feminism?
How do you believe that Western backing of Israel has not only been because of refusal to engage in deconstructing notions of anti-Semitism, but also extending Western imperialism with Israel's complicity in other horrific conflicts around the world, and how is Israel as a extension of the West? How has Israel been an extension of the West around the world?
Thank you. Okay, Ussama, you have 5 minutes before I think.
Well, thank you for those questions. There are a lot of questions. The question in the first question was, Samera was the first question was about how to situate myself, or how do the Palestinians situate themselves in the question of humanism in relation to Black people, enslavement, the Atlantic, and so where does the Palestinian fit in this story? Well, in the sense that, that's a huge question. That's a massive question, and I'm not going to do justice in terms of answering, but except to point to the fact that there have been phases. There have been phases of international. Well, first of all, the Palestinian question initially emerged in the context of sort of the post-Ottoman world, and then it became an Islamic and Arab question, and then it evolved actually in the 50s, especially in the 60s and 70s, into an international question of solidarity that actually brought in cases and thinking about the intersections with other anti-colonial, other movements, including Black liberation movements, and so on and so forth. And then it went into after the Cold War, where the Palestinians were put back into a sort of the two-state paradigm, and they were sort of again invisibilized or marginalized. But it's exploded again now, and we see this now with the various intersections that are taking place both in terms of solidarity work, both in terms of scholarly work and intersections. But I don't. It's such an important question that it deserves a much more thorough answer than I can give in a few seconds. As far as the other questions were
Nationalism, Palestinian nationalism.
Palestinian nationalism, again, like every nationalism, has its varieties, its responses, its pluralisms. But remember, Palestinian nationalism, of course, emerges, first of all, there's an Ottoman context initially. And then there is, of course, the post-Balfour Declaration British Mandate context. And then, of course, there's the context of exile and dispossession. So there are different stages to Palestinian nationalism. But again, scholars have examined this in exhausting detail, it seems to me. As to the question of two states, the issue for me is not, I'm sort of totally agnostic on the question of one state, two states, three states, 10 states, 15 states, because it's really for me a question of justice and equality. And that's the only thing that I can do as a scholar and as a witness. That's my job. And my job is not to, because it's, in the end, the question is right of return is a right under international law. UN Resolution 194 that Salman Abu Sitta told me yesterday in a conversation I had with him. He said that he reminded me that that resolution passed the day after, I don't know if he was right, but he said it passed the day after the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of the UN. In other words, he said these are rights that they don't expire and they don't get abrogated over time. Geopolitics prevents right now, because we've seen the Western states are cutting. The cruelty of the West towards the Palestinians is unconscionable. And of course, the cruelty of the Arab states, not just the Western states, it's Arab states as well, that have been absolutely shocking in their attitude towards the Palestinians. Nevertheless, these rights remain, and it's our duty as scholars is to study these things and to advocate for justice and equality, irrespective of the political compromises that occur, because we're not ultimately politicians. I don't know what the other question was. Was there another question?
The extension, Israel as an extension of the West doing imperial projects all over the world against other populations.
It's not just Israel. It's Israel obviously, but it's really the West. It's really, again, it's a topic that's been studied in depth. For example, Israel's collaboration with apartheid South Africa. That's a well-known sort of story, which is part of the irony of having post-apartheid South Africa bring the case of genocide to the International Court of Justice. It's not lost on me that there is this kind of history that was also being alluded to when post-apartheid South Africa, in other words, Nelson Mandela's South Africa, black and white, women and men, brought together that extraordinary case to the International Court of Justice. So, again, but the issue is not just, it's that there is the global north, global south. That geography has to be rethought, because we're now at a moment where there is extraordinary solidarity in the global north, which has always been the key to the Israel's ability to do what it's been doing to the Palestinians. And in the global south, there are massive shifts taking place. So it's no longer global south, global north as in fixed geographies. There's something else that is taking place, and you all are part of it. So thank you.
Well, let me thank Ussama Makdisi for this. He took us through a long journey and really offered some key points and arguments about this long history. I guess we will see many of you again in the next Let's Speak About Palestine event in a couple of weeks. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you everyone.